On a Wednesday afternoon in October of 1852, with rain driving sideways against the warehouse glass of Hamburg's Speicherstadt, Sophie Bauer sat alone at her desk and read a dead man's handwriting for the third time. The paper was yellowed at its edges and creased from years of folding, and the ink had faded to the color of old rust, but the words were still perfectly legible. 7 lines written in the tight, careful hand of Reinhold Schreier in the last week of his life, 15 years ago. 2 oil lamps burned on either side of her desk, despite the fact that it was 2:30 in the afternoon, because the rain had turned the harbor light the color of pewter, and Sophie needed to see every word clearly. She had been Vorsteherin of the Stiftungsschule für Mädchen Hamburg-Altona for 20 months now, responsible for 72 girls and a staff of 9, and she was not a woman who frightened easily. But she had read these 7 lines 3 times, and each time her eyes arrived at the phrase, Die Unterschrift des Landrats, she stopped and held still, and did not allow herself to finish the thought that was waiting at the end of it. She knew that Lothar Bauer had served as Landrat of Wernigerode from 1840 until 1846. She knew that Reinhold had died in September of 1837. She knew what a Landrat's signature over a rural parish meant in the matter of taxation. She was not a woman who required things to be spelled out for her. And that was precisely the difficulty. Because she did not want to know this. Not today. Not from a document that had spent 15 years lost in a consistorium archive before a pastor she had never met decided it was time to send it to her. She closed her eyes for 20 seconds. Then she folded Reinhold's sermon notes along their original creases, opened the upper left drawer of her desk, placed them inside, and turned the small brass key in the lock. The drawer closed with a sound like a full stop. At 3 o'clock precisely, the porter's bell rang from the building's ground floor. One long pull, which meant a visitor who had given his name and was requesting to be announced. Sophie sat without moving for a count of 4. Then she rose, crossed to the door of the office, opened it, and called down to the porter that he should send the visitor up. She returned to her desk, straightened the 2 stacks of correspondence that did not need straightening, and faced the door. Footsteps on the stairs, deliberate, unhurried, a man's wait. The door opened. Lothar Bauer entered wearing a dark coat that was wet across both shoulders and down the front. And he did not remove it, and he stopped on the far side of her desk, and they looked at each other across 3 feet of polished oak and 14 months of silence. 20 months earlier, on the evening of Saturday of the 8th of February, 1851, the sitting room of Gut-Kettenberg had been warm enough to make the cold outside feel distant and abstract. 3 wax candles burned on the mantelpiece, and the fireplace gave off a steady, even heat that had been tended since 7 o'clock. Sophie sat in the right armchair with the estate's account book open across her knees, running the Saturday inventory review she had performed every week for 6 years of marriage. Not because Lothar asked her to, but because she was the daughter of a pastor who had kept meticulous accounts. And because keeping meticulous accounts was one of the things she knew how to do without anyone telling her she was doing it correctly. Lothar sat in the left armchair, with a stack of administrative files, a pen in his right hand, and his eyes moving across whatever document he was reading, with the focused stillness that had always been his natural state in a room. 15 minutes of ordinary shared silence had passed. The fire settled once. The rain that had started at 9 o'clock tapped against the window in a rhythm that was almost regular. At 22 minutes past 10, Lothar set his pen down on the side table. He did not set it down carefully. He placed it there with a deliberateness that was different from carelessness. As a man sets down something he has been carrying for too long and has finally decided to release. He kept his eyes on the fire and did not look at Sophie. His voice, when he spoke, was entirely level. "Sophie," he said, "I have lived with you since our wedding day because I believed I owed it to you, and not because I wished to. And you have noticed it at breakfast for 3 months without knowing the reason." The fire made no comment. The rain continued. Sophie closed the account book without marking her page, an action that, for her, was its own kind of statement, and placed it on the round table beside her chair. She looked at Lothar for 2 full seconds. When she spoke, her voice had dropped a complete tone below her ordinary register, the way a temperature drops when the wind changes direction. "Lothar," she said, "I have been packing since Tuesday, because I believed you had grown weary of me. Now I hear that you believed you owed me something, and in 3 months I did not form a single suspicion about what you suggested this evening. Monday at 6:25, the coach stands in the yard, and you have until then to tell me the rest, or to say nothing." She rose. She did not wait for him to respond. She walked to the sitting room door and passed through it, leaving it open behind her, and she went up the stairs to the dressing room without looking back. Lothar remained in his armchair, with his eyes on the fire. On the side table beside him, the pen lay exactly where he had placed it, and Sophie, from the armchair she had just vacated, had seen his right hand tremble for 1 second as it released the pen after he finished speaking. 1 second only. In 6 years of marriage, she had never seen Lothar's hand tremble. It was the first visible crack in a composure she had always assumed was simply who he was. In the dressing room, 3 locked leather trunks stood against the north wall, their brass latches closed. On the writing table lay a small travel folio and an envelope bearing the blue seal of the Hamburg Senate. A job offer already accepted, a contract already drafted, a departure arranged for 11 days hence. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the envelope without touching it. The word Lothar had used was owed. She had heard it as a confession of obligation, a man admitting he had stayed with her out of duty rather than desire, which was exactly what 3 months of breakfast silences had led her to suspect. She had been so certain she understood what he meant. She was not certain of anything now. Lothar remained in the sitting room for 18 minutes. At 22 minutes past 10 he came upstairs. The dressing room door was locked from within. He did not knock. Sunday, the 9th of February, arrived gray and cold, with the same rain that had begun the night before still moving across the hearts in heavy curtains. Sophie came downstairs at 7, ate alone in the dining room, and then went to the estate's small office and opened the account book to the page she had not marked. She read the Saturday inventory with the careful technical attention of someone who is doing one thing in order not to think about another. She worked through the livestock accounts, the grain ledger, the quarterly fuel entries. On the 14th page, in the margin beside the account entry for the Schorndorf Parish Holdings, she found a notation in Lothar's own handwriting, dated August 1842, that read, "Tax reclassification confirmed. LB the entry itself recorded a payment of $340 against a reclassification of the parish's agricultural holdings." Sophie read the notation twice. She did not yet understand what it meant, only that it existed, that it was in Lothar's hand, and that it was dated 9 years ago, 3 years before their marriage. She copied the notation carefully into her travel folio, closed the account book, and returned it to the shelf. Monday the 10th brought a visitor no one had invited. The coach from Quedlinburg arrived in the yard at 9:30 in the morning, and Margarita Bauer, Lothar's mother, descended from it in a state of purpose that required no announcement. Sophie heard her voice in the entrance hall from the sitting room where she was sitting, and she did not open the door. She told Frida through the closed door that she was not receiving visitors. Frida relayed this information. Margarita sat in the entrance hall and waited. She waited for 4 hours, which was, Sophie reflected, a considerable act of endurance for a woman of 71. At 4 o'clock, Lothar emerged from his private study, the first time in 2 days that he had come out of it, and walked to the entrance hall. Sophie heard his voice, low and without inflection, and then the sound of movement, and then the front door, and then footsteps crossing the yard's stone paving. She went to the sitting room window and stood to one side of it, where she could see without being seen. In the yard, Lothar had his mother by the arm, not unkindly, but with the firm guidance of a man who has already made a decision. He helped her up into the coach and then stood beside the open door and spoke to her for 5 minutes. Sophie could not hear the words, but she saw Margarita's face when Lothar finished speaking. The way her expression shifted from indignation to something that looked, from this distance, like grief. Margareta pulled the coach door closed herself. The vehicle moved out through the gate. Lothar stood in the center of the empty yard for a moment before turning and walking back toward the house. Sophie stepped away from the window before he could look up and see her there. The following morning, Tuesday the 11th of February, the 4th day since Lothar's confession, Sophie arrived at the district administrative office in Wernigerode at 5 minutes to 10 with her travel folio under her arm. She had written ahead to request the session. Justitiar Friedrich Volkmar, a careful man of 56, with the deliberate manner of someone who had spent 30 years reading documents other people wished he hadn't, was already present when she arrived, seated to the right of Lothar's desk. Lothar was behind the desk. He rose when Sophie entered, which was the kind of formality that, under the circumstances, felt like a wound dressed with clean linen. Sophie placed the 6-page dowry repayment contract on the desk without preamble. She had had it drafted by a private notary in Halberstadt the previous week. Volkmar picked it up and read it. He read for 17 minutes without speaking. The room was very quiet. When he finished, he set the document down and looked at Lothar. Lothar said, "Justitiar, if I name for you this morning an additional document for private delivery, one that my wife is to receive on Monday morning without learning today what it contains, can you include a legally binding clause in the dowry repayment contract, authenticated by my signature today, to that effect?" He had addressed Volkmar, not Sophie. His voice was the same administrative voice he had used at every official meeting Sophie had ever attended with him. Measured, precise, entirely without effect. Volkmar said, "That can be drafted, yes. You'll need to name the document by reference, not by content, and the notary will require a sealed copy of the delivery instruction." He paused. "Frau Bauer, do you consent to signing an addendum whose specific subject you will not be told today?" Sophie looked at Lothar for a moment. She said quietly, "Yes." Volkmar drafted the addendum in his careful hand, read it back aloud, and passed it across. Sophie noted that Lothar had not looked at her once since she entered the room. The signing proceeded clause by clause. When Lothar reached the 5th clause, the one that confirmed the return of the full dowry in 3 installments, the first payable on the 18th of February, he signed his name and set the pen down on the green blotter with slightly more force than was necessary. The nib left a visible ink stain on the leather, dark and spreading. Volkmar did not comment. Sophie saw it, and she understood without being told then that Lothar's administrative composure, which had held through 17 minutes of Volkmar's reading and 3 signatures and 1 clause that required him to legally instruct a notary to deliver a document he could not name, had just transmitted its second physical register of strain. The blotter would carry that stain permanently. The contract was concluded at 11 minutes to 12. Before Volkmar could gather his papers and leave, a knock at the outer door produced Ferdinand Holzendorf, 54 years old, tax secretary of the district since 1838. A compact man with the particular self-possession of someone who believes that administrative order is a moral good. He had not been invited. He had, Sophie understood immediately, come because he had learned that she had requested access to the Schorndorf tax archive in Halberstadt, and the Schorndorf tax archive was under his jurisdiction. Holzendorf asked, with precise courtesy, for 5 minutes alone with the Landrat. Lothar received him in the corridor. Sophie, still at the desk with Volkmar, heard the exchange. Not the words, but the rhythm of it. Holzendorf spoke for approximately 40 seconds. Lothar responded in 3 words. There was a brief silence. Then Lothar came back into the study, went to the desk, took a sheet of paper, wrote 3 lines on it, signed it, and handed it to Sophie directly. In front of Holzendorf, who had followed him back into the room and now stood in the doorway, observing. The sheet was an unlimited authorization for Sophie to consult the Schorndorf archive at the Church Consistori in Halberstadt, signed by the Landrat and dated that morning. Holzendorf looked at the authorization and then at Lothar, and said nothing. He left. Sophie spent Wednesday completing the estate's inventory and writing 3 letters of recommendation for Frida and 2 of the other servants she had dismissed. Letters that described each woman's specific competencies in enough detail to be genuinely useful, because Sophie was not willing to let the dissolution of her marriage cost other people their livelihoods. She drafted a final letter to her friend Christiane in Hamburg, confirming her arrival date of the 18th. A letter arrived from Eleanor, Lothar's sister in Halle, requesting that Sophie reconsider or at minimum speak with Lothar before Monday. Sophie read it, set it on the writing table, and did not reply. Lothar spent Wednesday and Thursday in his private study. On Wednesday night, Sophie lay awake and listened to the sound of the fireplace in the room below. The particular crackle of paper burning, which was different from wood. She did not go down. Thursday morning, she packed the remaining items in the dressing room and locked all 3 trunks. The coach was confirmed for Monday at 6 o'clock. At 6:30 on Thursday evening, while Sophie was eating alone in the dining room, Frida came to the door and said that a Pastor Druitz had arrived from Schorndorf without announcement and was asking to speak with Frau Bauer. Sophie set down her fork. She asked Frida to put him in the sitting room and said she would come down at 7. Pastor Theodor Druitz was 49 years old, with the weathered look of a man who had spent decades in a rural parish and had not been sheltered from the difficulties that entailed. He had succeeded Reinhold Schreier at the Schorndorf parish in the autumn of 1837, 3 weeks after Reinhold's death. And Sophie had met him exactly once, briefly, at the funeral. He stood when she entered the sitting room and held his hat in both hands. And there was something in his manner that Sophie recognized from years of being a pastor's daughter. The specific gravity of a man who has come to deliver information he would have preferred not to carry. On the round table of the sitting room, Druitz placed a rough wooden box that smelled of old paper and cold stone. He said that 3 weeks earlier, during a reorganization of the Consistori archive in Halberstadt, a crate of papers had been found in a storage room that had been sealed since 1838. Personal papers of Reinhold Schreier that had never been delivered to his widow after his death. The consistory had asked Druitz, as the current incumbent of the Schorndorf parish, to review them and determine what should be officially registered and what should be returned to the family. Druitz had spent 3 weeks reading them. Then he had driven to Gut-Kettenberg. Sophie opened the box. She worked through its contents for an hour with Druids seated across the table, occasionally answering her questions about dates and provenance. There were administrative letters, a partial manuscript of a sermon series on the Psalms, 2 inventories in Reinhold's hand, and near the bottom of the box, folded in a piece of brown paper and tied with a length of cord that had dried and cracked with age, a sheaf of loose pages that were clearly sermon notes, the working drafts Reinhold made during the week before he preached. Sophie untied the cord. She found the notes dated the 12th of September, 1837. Reinhold had died on the 21st. She turned to the 7th page, where the handwriting became smaller and more compressed, the way Reinhold's always had when he was writing something that was costing him effort, and she read 7 lines that were not part of any sermon. The lines described a signature. They described what the signature had required of the parish. They described what the parish had been forced to sell to meet the obligation: a library, a clock, furniture. And they described the state of the man who had sold these things. The lines ended with a sentence in Latin that Reinhold had written and then crossed out, and then written again beneath the crossing out. God forgive him. I no longer can. Druids said quietly, Frau Bauer, your first husband wrote 7 lines in his final week of preaching about a signature he could not name, because he did not know whether it had been set from malice or from duty. I read those 7 lines for 3 weeks before coming to you this evening. And I believe Reinhold would have wanted you to read them without knowing whose signature it was. But I cannot promise you that you will not find out regardless. Sophie held the notes in both hands. Druids reached forward to adjust the page so she could read more clearly, and for 2 seconds, their fingers were in contact across the paper. His weathered and still, hers steady with the particular steadiness of someone who is using stillness as a tool. She asked him to leave her a copy of the 7 pages. He agreed. He said the remainder of the box would need to go back to the consistory for official registration. At 8:30, he gathered everything except the 7 pages, replaced the lid on the wooden box, and said good night. Sophie walked him to the door. She came back inside, went upstairs, closed the dressing room door, and sat on the floor with her back against the north wall and the 3 locked trunks beside her. And she cried without making any sound for 22 minutes. She cried for Reinhold, which she had not done in 15 years, because 15 years ago she had been a young woman who needed to survive, and crying had not been something she could afford. She cried for herself at 24, sitting in a rented room in Halberstadt, with no money and no family, and no clear understanding of how her husband had come to die so quickly at the end. And she cried for Lothar, which she had never done at all, because she was only now beginning to understand the weight he had been carrying. Through every breakfast silence and every quiet evening and every administrative hour of 6 years of marriage. At 10 o'clock she washed her face, went downstairs, and knocked on the door of Lothar's private study. He said, "Come in." She opened the door. Lothar was standing behind his desk, and when she entered, he did not sit. He simply stood and remained standing. And Sophie understood after a moment that he was not going to sit because he could not. There was something in the way he stood that was not composure. It was the posture of a man who has been standing in the same position for so long that sitting down has become impossible, not physically, but in some other way that did not have a simple name. She did not sit either. They stood at 1.5 meters apart in the lamplight, and Lothar said, for the first time in 6 years of marriage in her presence, the name Reinhold Schreier. He told her what he had signed in August of 1842. He told her that he had not read the individual parcels in the reclassification order, that he had trusted the tax secretary's technical report and signed as the third of 3 required signatures without examining what was beneath. He told her that in December of that year, during a routine review of the tax office's collection accounts, he had read the name Schreier against a payment record and had gone back to look at what had been sold to make that payment. He told her that in January of 1843, he had learned from the consistory that Reinhold had died in September. He said all of this in the same precise, administrative voice he used for everything. And Sophie listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said 4 words. "You kept the document?" Lothar said steadily, "Yes." "In your desk?" Sophie said. Lothar said, "Yes, since January 1843. Sophie nodded once. She left the study and went upstairs. Before she slept, she opened her professional diary, the one she used for school business, not for personal correspondence, and wrote 1 line. "It changes nothing about Monday, but it changes everything that Monday means." On Saturday, the 15th of February, Sophie traveled alone to Halberstadt with Lothar's unlimited authorization folded in her travel folio. She arrived at the church consistory at 9:30 and was received by consistorial counselor Dr. Hennig, a precise man in his 60s, who had read the authorization, confirmed its validity, and ordered the Schorndorf tax archive for 1842 to be brought to the reading room without further discussion. Sophie had been working through the documents for 2 hours when the door of the reading room opened and Ferdinand Holzendorf entered. He had ridden from Wernigerode. He was breathing with the effort of it, and his boots were muddy to the knee. Holzendorf said that the archive was under his administrative supervision and that any consultation required his presence as official witness. Dr. Hennig said that the authorization on the table was unlimited and bore the Landrat's signature, and that Holzendorf's presence had not been requested. Holzendorf said that he was not leaving. Hennig went to the door, spoke briefly to the building's warden, and Holzendorf was escorted from the building with the particular indignity of a man who has gambled on his own authority and lost. The door closed. Sophie turned back to the documents on the table. She found the August 1842 tax reclassification order for the Schorndorf district. She found the 3 signatures, the tax secretary first, the district councillor second, and Lothar Bauer's signature third. L. Bauer, Landrat, with the date the 23rd of August, 1842. She found, in a subsequent folder, an inventory prepared by the parish deacon in October of that year, listing the assets sold to meet the reclassification assessment. A library of 412 volumes, valued at 80 thaler. 1 standing clock, the property of the late Andreas Schreier, father of the incumbent, valued at 40 thaler. All furniture of the parish house, except the bed and writing table, valued at 60 thaler in aggregate. The total came to 340 thaler exactly. She read the inventory through once, carefully, and then closed the folder and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Reinhold had died in September. The inventory was dated October. He had spent his last weeks in a parish house with no furniture, no books, and his father's clock gone. The illness had been real. She had watched it take him over 2 years, the slow diminishment of a man she had loved. But the final weeks, the weeks she had thought were simply the sickness completing its work, had been something else as well. Sophie returned to the estate on Sunday morning. She did not speak to Lothar when she arrived. She went to her room, changed out of her traveling clothes, and sat at the writing table for an hour before she began the 3 letters she needed to write. One to Christian confirming the arrival date and the school schedule for March. One to the Hamburg mayor's office regarding the office lease, and one to Frida with instructions for the household accounts after Monday. She sealed all 3 and left them on the writing table. In the study below, Lothar spent Sunday alone. At 11 o'clock that night, Sophie heard the fireplace again. Paper burning, a sustained sound, longer than a single sheet. She learned later, from the notary's confirmation note that arrived in Hamburg in April, that Lothar had also written that night to confirm that the 1842 document would be delivered to Sophie by hand on Monday morning, as specified in the 5th clause of the contract. He had sent the note before burning the letter. Sophie did not sleep. She read Reinhold's 7 lines one more time by lamplight, then folded the pages, placed them in the wooden box Druitt's had left, and locked the box inside the 3rd trunk, which she resecured with its brass latch. The coach stood harnessed in the yard from 6 o'clock on Monday morning. All 3 trunks were loaded onto the roof rack by 6:15, lashed with leather straps by the coachman and his assistant, who worked in the cold without speaking. The yard was dark. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge to the east, and the cobblestones were wet from overnight rain that had stopped an hour ago. Sophie stood in the south portal in her dark traveling coat with her travel folio in her left hand and waited. The coachman had been told 6:34. It was 6:28. Lothar appeared in the opposite portal at 6:28, carrying 2 items: a folded sheet of paper and a brown envelope that had not been sealed. He crossed the 12 meters of the yard without hurrying, and Sophie crossed from her side, and they stopped 3 meters apart on the wet cobblestones. The coachman and his assistant had gone to attend to the horses and were not looking. Lothar extended the folded sheet first. Sophie took it. She unfolded it and read it in 20 seconds. The August 1842 tax reclassification order for the Schorndorf district, with the 3 signatures at the bottom, the 3rd of which was L. Bauer, Landrat. She had already confirmed its existence in Halberstadt. Reading it now, in his hand's extension of it, was a different thing entirely. She folded it along its original creases and placed it in the interior pocket of her coat. Their fingers had touched briefly over the paper, a second and a half, no more. Lothar extended the brown envelope. Inside it, she could feel through the paper, were the 7 folded pages of Reinhold's sermon notes. Druitt's had entrusted them to Lothar after her departure, to be returned to her when she was ready. She took the envelope without opening it and placed it in the same interior pocket. Another brief contact. 2 seconds over paper, the last. Sophie said, "Lothar, I am taking the 1842 tax document to Hamburg and keeping it. I am taking my first husband's sermon notes and keeping them. Tonight you will burn your copy of the tax document, because I will not have 2 versions of it in Germany, one of which spent 9 years in your desk." Lothar nodded. Sophie boarded the coach. The coachman closed the door. At 6:34, the vehicle passed through the gate of Gut-Kettenberg and turned south toward the road. Lothar remained standing in the center of the yard for 6 minutes. The cobblestones were still wet. The sky to the east had begun to lighten, a thin gray line above the ridge. He stood until the sound of the carriage wheels had entirely disappeared, and then he went inside. And now it was October of 1852, and Lothar was standing on the other side of Sophie's desk in a wet coat, and the rain was still moving sideways against the Speicherstadt glass, and the upper left drawer of the desk was locked. Sophie said, "Sit down, if you wish." Lothar said, "I would prefer to stand for a moment." He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and removed a brown envelope, different from the one he had handed her in the yard, but the same size, the same paper. He placed it on the desk between them, but did not push it toward her. Then he spoke, and his voice was the same voice it had always been, measured, precise, and carrying under its surface the particular quality of a man who has rehearsed nothing and is simply saying what is true. "Sophie," he said, 19 months ago I burned the copy of the 1842 document on the night of the 17th of February, as you required. And since then, only your original in Hamburg and the archive copy at the consistory exist. Pastor Druitz entrusted me with your first husband's sermon notes 6 weeks ago, because he felt I should bring them to you in person after the consistory officially registered them in June. I am not asking whether you will be my wife again. I am asking whether I may give you the notes today, and whether I may come once a year at Pentecost and stay 3 days at a boarding house 3 streets from here, to hear how your 72 girls from Altona are getting on." He stopped. The rain hit the glass in a long diagonal gust, and then settled back to its previous rhythm. Sophie did not speak immediately. She turned her head and looked at the rain for 20 seconds. Not evasively, but with the specific attention of someone who is giving an answer the time it requires. Then she opened the upper left drawer with a small brass key, took out Reinhold's sermon notes. The copy Druitz had left her in February of 1851, the one she had read 3 times this afternoon, and extended them across the desk to Lothar. The first time in 15 years that anything written in Reinhold Schreier's hand had passed from her to Lothar. He took the pages without opening them and placed them carefully in his coat's interior pocket. His hands were steady. Sophie said, "Sit down, Lothar." He sat. She sat. The rain continued. "Tell me about Wernigerode," she said. "Is Volkmar still at the office?" "Retired in September," Lothar said. "His replacement is younger, competent enough." "And Holzendorf?" "Transferred to Magdeburg in 51. The complaint he filed against me was archived without sanction." He paused. "I imagine you knew that." "I heard," Sophie said. "I didn't ask." Lothar said, "How many of your girls are from outside Hamburg?" 14 from Altona proper, 12 from Wandsbek, 6 from as far as Lübeck," Sophie said. "The youngest is 9. She arrived in March with nothing. Her mother sent her with a letter that said only that she was a good girl who deserved to learn something useful." She looked at the desk for a moment. "She is learning mathematics faster than any of the others." Lothar said, "Reinhold would have liked that." Sophie looked at him. It was the second time in their acquaintance, the first having been in the study at the estate on the night of the 13th of February, 1851, that he had said Reinhold's name in her presence. She did not look away, and he did not look away, and after a moment she said, "Yes, he would." They talked for 18 minutes. About Hamburg, about the school's finances, about the Pentecost calendar for 1853, about a boarding house on the Deichstrasse that Lothar said was clean and reasonably priced, and 3 streets from the Speicherstadt, about Wernigerode's winter, which had been unusually mild, about nothing that required courage to say, and everything that required the previous 14 months to make possible. At 18 minutes past 3, Lothar rose and straightened his coat, which had dried in the warmth of the office to a darker shade than it had been when he arrived. He walked to the door. In the doorway he stopped, as though he had forgotten something, though Sophie did not think he had forgotten anything. She stood. She crossed the office in 5 steps. The distance between her desk and the door was not large, and she stopped at 30 centimeters from him. She raised her right hand and placed her palm flat against his left cheek. His face was warm and close-shaved, and she felt the slight unevenness of it against her palm, the texture of a face she had been in proximity to for 6 years without once touching in this way. 3 seconds. Lothar closed his eyes. Sophie did not speak. She removed her hand and stepped back, and Lothar opened his eyes and looked at her, and nodded once, slowly, and left the office without touching the door. The door swung on its hinge and remained ajar for 2 seconds before the draft from the stairwell pulled it closed. Sophie stood in the place where she had been standing for another 3 minutes before she returned to her desk. The rain continued against the glass, diagonal and steady, the way it had been at 2:30 when she first opened the drawer and took out Reinhold's sermon notes and read the 7 lines for the first time. The oil lamps burned. The drawer was open now and empty, and the small brass key lay on the desk beside it. In the years that followed, Lothar came to Hamburg at Pentecost, a Monday to a Wednesday, 3 days, always the same boarding house on the Deichstrasse. He and Sophie met on the Tuesday, in the office or occasionally at a coffee house 2 streets over. And they talked about the school and about Wernigerode and about whatever had happened in the year between. The visits lasted 11 years. In the spring of 1864, Lothar died in Wernigerode of a heart complaint that had apparently been present for some time without his mentioning it to anyone. Sophie received the news by post from the district administrative office in a letter that was official in its form and entirely without personal content, which was the kind of communication that such an office was equipped to send. She read it at her desk, folded it, and placed it in the upper left drawer beside the 1842 tax document, which had been there since February of 1851, and which she had not opened since the morning she folded it in the yard. She continued as Vorsteherin of the Stiftungsschule für Mädchen Hamburg-Altona until her death in 1879. The document remained in the drawer remained locked. The key remained in the small porcelain dish on the upper right corner of the desk, where she had put it on the afternoon of the 22nd of October, 1852, and where it stayed for 27 years, present, visible, and entirely unnecessary, because Sophie knew what was in the drawer. And that was enough.